Good morning, everybody. Today is March 10th of 2023. My name is Patrick McCurdy, and I have the honor of gathering with people that I truly admire and respect. And we're going to have a discussion today. This series is called Still in the Fight, and it's coffees and conversation with the power of our story. And I don't think I could say it a little bit more awkward, but nonetheless, the power of our story. And we're going to facilitate a discussion today. My topic for all of you and my question is a two-part question. The first part is, what is your definition, or more accurately, what does it mean to you to lean in? It's a term we hear a lot in society. So what does it actually mean? And then I'd like you to give me an example in your life of you or somebody else leaning in. And then looking at my screen, Janet, how about you? What does it mean to you? And can you give me some examples of that in your life?
Well, for me, a lot of things that are a struggle for me is actually doing. And so leaning in is just doing it and trusting, and I have had to do that. And sometimes I force myself, and sometimes I go kicking and screaming, but I eventually do it. But that's, to me, is leaning in, is to just, even when you don't want to do something. But I always say that I feel like I'm being pushed from, behind to do some of the things I do. And then I met this wonderful shaman, and she says, what if you thought of it as a magnet and you're being drawn to do it? Changing that narrative made a big difference. But I think leaning into it, whether just because it feels right for us, that we have to do, compelled to do. But support has a huge thing. I think that when you're surrounded with people that are cheerleaders rather than naysayers, it's easier to lean in. So an example that you're looking for.
Hold your example for a sec, because I have a question. Is it actually leaning in when you're surrounded by cheerleaders and not naysayers?
I think so, because do you know what? Leaning in they don't need to know, but just knowing that you have that support if you need it. And because I think all of us have something that we doubt ourselves in, and that we don't think, but when you're in a group that doesn't belittle you and stuff, it's easier to lean into something. It gives you that courage, and they don't need to know that that's happening. You just know that if you needed support, that they're there. It's just knowing that you have that. It's not necessarily that they need to know that you're struggling with that.
Okay. And what was your example of that?
Well, I'm going to use the book that I published. Okay. And that was in 2011. I had an idea, right? The title came to my head. I put it out to a group I was in. I says, who wants to be in this book? I had no authors. I had no publisher. I had no inkling on how to do it. And I just took that step and did it. And each step I took was closer to something else opening up, and somebody showing up, or somebody suggesting this. And so if we don't lean into something, there's not an opportunity for other things to show up.
That was awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you. Michelle, how about you? I know sometimes you have to leave. Are you able to answer that for us?
I am. And typical of me, I'm going to offer a little bit different insight into this. When someone talks about leaning into something, I actually go to a negative place, because I've had to over the past 2 years, redefine what leaning in looks like from me. Going into my career field as a first responder at 19 years old, I did not have healthy boundaries. I leaned into my career, and I leaned in so much that I lost myself. Not that I even truly knew who I was, but I knew that I was going to give my all. I lived at work. I worked overtime. I worked for free. I was always available. And I truly leaned into the concept of being a first responder. And I did that in a very unhealthy manner for 14 years. So the last 2 years, I really spent a lot of time of saying, what am I choosing to lean into? And how do I do it in a way that's not sabotaging my mental health or what I stand for? So now I have learned that it's something where if I'm going to lean in, it's okay to be all in, but still have my boundaries. And for me, a lot of my journey with healing through PTSD has been a requirement to lean in. If you're not into your healing modalities 100%, you're not going to get what you can get out of them. My example I pull from is last night was 62 Romeo. I leaned in 100% into that program for 6 weeks and gave it my all. And there is no way I would have been able to come out with the amazing sleep quality that I have now if I wouldn't have done that. And so for me, leaning into stuff has really been a journey to define what that looks like to lean in a healthy way.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, to lean in means put in the work.
Put into the work, but know where your boundaries are. I lean into every relationship that I establish. People are my addiction. People have been my addiction for my whole life. And it took me quite a while to figure that out. So leaning into what's important to you, but knowing that you first have a responsibility to yourself.
Okay. And I think you kind of did, but do you have an example of how that has affected your life?
Well, I got negative examples from when I was leaning in unhealthy manners, and I have positive examples, but I like to pull on the positive now. And I think leaning into my therapy with Dr. Susan, who is a veteran herself, she was assigned to me by workers' comp, really leaning into her therapy and leaning into 22-0, 62 Romeo, all the different modalities or techniques that I've tried, I think has shown me the growth that I have. And I think just my presence on these meetings speak for themselves from a year and a half ago to today.
And you are crushing it too, by the way, sis. Yeah, you are. I mean, just the short period of time I've had the honor of knowing you, I can see growth there. So it would be exciting to see pictures or video from a year ago.
I'm going to find one of our old recordings.
Where you look tired.
I was usually in the dark.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I see Kelly just joined us. I'm excited to see you, Kelly. Haven't seen you in a while. Did you hear what we're discussing?
Yes, I've actually been sitting here for a little bit listening.
I had to shift my screen to see all the people. So what are your thoughts?
So whenever I think about leaning in, I guess I'm a lot like Michelle. I sometimes have a negative connotation to it. So the phrase "embrace the suck" comes to mind. When you know that it's just not going to be great, but you just embrace it and bear down and try to weather the storm. So for me, when I think about that, I envision myself kind of in a storm, trying to navigate my path, even though it's become very cloudy and heavy and rainy and cold and all the things. And knowing that, again, it's a lot like Michelle said, for me, especially at this time. I think she and I are probably in very similar places when it comes to my therapy, that I'm able to look at a situation that is potentially very negative and figure out a way to not embrace the suck, but embrace the ability to push through that. And like she said, put up boundaries and know that this is these are my walls and this is where I'm going to live, and that is okay. Being able to set boundaries for what I can and can't tolerate, whether I can, how much of the storm I can weather and how much of the storm is just going to have to be set aside.
I like that. I'll share a little bit later if I have a chance, but do you have any examples?
Oh goodness, I have a lot of examples. I
How
guess
about- How about when somebody leaned in for you on some occasion? Do you have one of those?
yeah, I guess it would be the most recent one when my husband, who is very anti-mental health, doesn't understand mental health, doesn't like that just doesn't resonate with him. He just doesn't understand that. When I was finally at my rock bottom and told him, I simply can't do this anymore. Like, something has to give. I'm done. This is not okay. Like, it was not going to be pretty. And he leaned in 110%. And he said he was so supportive, and whatever you have to do, we're going to get through this. I told him I was going to go to counseling, really thought it was going to be an argument. Like, I really thought he was going to give some pushback, and he was very 110% all in, ready to support me in any way. And he continues to do so. He doesn't ask me about my sessions other than to ask if it went okay. He doesn't push, he doesn't prod, he lets me do it my way. And he's been so incredibly supportive. If I have a bad night and he'll ask me, if everything's okay, like the other night I told him, I said, it's just, I need to decompress and everything around me is just, there's too much stimulus. Like it's too much. He immediately turned on the TV, got the dogs out of the room, sat with his hands in his lap and was just still, because he knew in that moment I was being hyperstimulated and it was not going to be pretty. So I guess the best example is when he came all in for something that he completely doesn't understand, but was willing to be there for me.
I used to be that guy. And so I learned the hard way that it is an important topic, and it's just as important as all the tough guy stuff I used to immerse myself in, all the combatives and training and shooting and all that stuff. That's only a small piece of survival for a police officer, or I guess for other people that are into that. So I learned the hard way that this is one of the more important pieces, because you have to be capable of sustaining yourself. So I appreciate that, Kelly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah, how about if I go to you? And I see Paul joined us too.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Really interesting, Michelle and Kelly. I really hear you. And interestingly enough, when I thought about leaning in, I thought about getting into this arena. It's leaning in when it's really uncomfortable and you don't have the history to really encourage you to go forward, but you really feel like it's the way to go. To me, that was the thought that came to me when you said lean in. There's no guarantees that it's going to work. You may end up really humiliated. So that was what I thought about leaning in. And the example was, I think, when I felt very passionate about getting into this gap of preventing suicide. And it's very interesting because Kelly and Michelle, I was so wholehearted. And that was the time where I had to really learn lessons of what is not my lane. I came out of these different situations just absolutely heartbroken. And I thought this would be an easy time to quit. And that is when I had to really lean in. It's like, I believe in this. I haven't quite figured it out yet. Do I want to attempt this again? And I think what I learned from that first experience is to be wholehearted in the work, but understand that things could fall apart, totally fall apart. Am I happy with my own self and my life, even if all that falls apart? So it's this feeling of going wholeheartedly full force, but holding on very loosely. And that has brought me a lot of freedom. So I needed to lean in. I needed to have the courage to do that, to learn this, to see the clarity of boundaries that I needed. And that too, I learned a huge lesson. So I hope that fits the question.
It certainly does. And it's the reason I ask it the way I do is because everybody's going to have a different perspective. And that's what I'm trying to draw out and elicit. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. It sounded like a speech at a graduation ceremony.
Oh.
It was inspiring.
Oh, good.
Chris, what about you, bud?
All right, there it is. So for me, leaning in's a mindset. And for me, leaning in should start long before you actually need to lean in, because you're kind of behind the power curve, in my opinion, at that point. Leaning in to any circumstance means you're ready for whatever's going to confront you, whether it's a headwind, whether it's a fight, whether it's a task or a chore, you're leaning into it. So that if you just walk upright, it is an analogy, and that headwind comes at you a strong gust, it's very likely to put you on your ass. And it's very hard to get up from that point, and you're going backwards. If you're walking upright and you're not on a good, stable, always walking platform, somebody's going to come in and attack you. It's very easy to do. You're an easy mark for somebody who looks like you just don't care and you have no self-awareness. Leaning in does not mean that you're not going to fail, because you're going to fail all the time. I do it several times a day. But when I fail, when I get attacked, I fail forward. I'm always progressing that way. So even when, and let's say somebody wanted to attack me from behind, proverbially, I'm going to fall forward. Maybe I can somersault, and that I'm already getting that momentum to get my ass right back up and to dig in. So I don't take that as a literal sense. For me, it is very much a mindset. The older I've gotten and some of the things that I've gone through in my life have kind of led me to believe that through a lot of failures, leaning forward, leaning into it, embracing the suck, whatever you want to call it, will always do you better. But as I've said so many times, it is a deliberate decision that you have to make day to day, sometimes moment to moment, to always lean in. And when you're at your weakest, that's okay, because when you're leaning forward and you have to crumble and you hit your knees, you can still fall, you're still falling forward and you're still crawling and making progress, as incremental as it might be. And an analogy, without putting any personal thing out there, it just makes life easier. If you're walking up a hill and you're trying to walk straight back, that's a really tough fight. But if you lean into it, it makes it much easier. So that's not a specific example, just an analogy that I think we can all relate to, no matter what our perspectives are, that might relate. And so even if you're, tired, you need to stop and take a lean forward, you're still progressing forward.
I like that. You and Kelly both used the storm analogy. You talked about the wind, and she talked about a storm and rain. And that's one of the visual pictures I have too. So I like that. Do you have an example you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think they come daily, whether it be with a procedural fight. I'm gonna lose you for about 5 seconds here, so give me 1 second. Going through a dead spot. I'm sorry. Okay, are you there?
Yeah, you turned into a robot for a minute.
There you go. It's a little spot on my block. Sometimes it's daily. And I won't use anyone or organization or thing, but you can always have those fights. But as we all struggle to choose to be happy every day, it's a struggle. So I'm always making that deliberate decision to, whatever the negativity is coming, I'm bracing for it. I'm ready for that storm. I don't know when it's coming. There's no weather forecast to that, but I know something's going to try to sucker punch me, and I'm ready for it because I'm attacking it, even in my driving, kind of leaning forward. And I know that's a kind of a crappy example, but it's something that I have to do frequently, multiple times a day, just to maintain a steady heading for my emotional and mental health and well-being and the happiness of my family.
Good. Thanks. I appreciate it, Chris. I should have you wrap things up because you always bring the uplifting motivational speech with it. Thanks, Chris. Paul, you just joined us shortly, a little while ago, and I don't know if you heard the topic. So the two questions are, did you hear it?
I think I heard part of it.
Okay. What does it mean to you to lean in? And then can you give me an example?
Sure. I oftentimes, although I don't speak about it very much, refer to martial arts because I spent a good number of years learning and teaching and doing all of that kind of thing. And one of the things that you learn very quickly, and you learn it as a cop as well, is situational awareness, i.e., what's going on around you. What are the threats? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And so I had a guy come at me one time, and he took a karate pose before he lunged into me. And what he wasn't counting on was that I took his hand, his fist in my hands, and just pulled him over my knee and dropped him. And so that's a time when you don't want to lean in too much. You want to take advantage of the momentum of the other person to preserve yourself. But leaning into me in an emotional or psychological setting, not a physical setting, is really paying attention to the details. It is focusing. It is not being distracted. And I think all of those are little components to the notion of leaning in. It's not just the physical act of leaning forward. It is the mental act of accommodating what is going on around you for everybody's benefit, not just for yours.
Good. And you, with your personal definition, you gave an example. So do you have another example you want to share, or do you want to stick with that?
That was a physical situation, the example that I shared there. And I will give it some thought for a moment because I'm not fully here yet, but I'm hoping to be, and I'll get back to you before the program's over.
No problem. Would you like me to go to Jim? Jim joined us while you were talking.
Sure.
Or just before. Jim, it's good to see you again, my friend. How are you?
Great. I heard the questions. I think for me, that concept of leaning in, right, is to kind of immerse yourself physically, emotionally, mentally into a situation, so that you have a full understanding of it, and can have a committed path, to kind of move forward with that respect. And I'll just give the example for me. My battle with or my dealing with and overcoming some cancer issue, was all about that, right? I was all in emotionally, with a positive attitude to address that. I was all in with, knowledge base, right? Research and, making good decisions, etc. And I was all in with being an example for others and dedicating that I was committed to the emotional side and the positive attitude side, but also I made, lifestyle changes with respect to, my diet, and stuck to it, and was, committed to that all in kind of concept, and physical fitness, and, just everything around it. I was, leaning in to give myself the best opportunity to address that issue. And so that's, and I can take that into, the work environment of, being fully immersed and being the example, and, all those types of things. So that's kind of my story on it.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Patrick, I've
yes,
thought of a couple of things that
Okay.
I will just share briefly. The first, and we touched on this earlier, the first is going into roll call, for instance, and you have all of your people there, and you're laying out the plan for the day and what the concerns are and what the issues are for that particular shift. And being willing to listen to what other people have to say is incredibly important. And you pointed that out earlier today, and that really stuck with me, because it is important. And yes, you can be the commander, but the fact is that if you're not willing to listen to anybody, you have no buy-in. If you're not willing to have any willingness to listen to somebody, you have no trust. And so I think all of those things are components of this leaning in. And the other thought that came to mind, which is much more personal, is I decided some time ago, after I started experiencing some fairly difficult physical issues, was to be a strong participant in my health care rather than an observer of it. And I'll give you an example. These 3 books came in the mail yesterday. I'm going to meet with a doctor on Monday about the spinal implant stimulator. And this is my reading for the weekend. And I could just sit there and say, well, yeah, I got all the books and that's cool. No, I want to know what's on the inside. And that for me is a form of leaning in. That is participating rather than just sitting around and being an observer. Because when you just sit around and be an observer, the first thing you do is find somebody to blame when things don't go right. And that doesn't serve anybody. So.
Well said. I want to make sure if anybody else joined that I don't miss. I'm going to borrow from Chris and Kelly some analogies, and Jim alluded to this too. For me personally, I feel I see a visual, and I have 2 separate definitions of leaning in. And the storm analogy that both Chris and Kelly used really resonates with me, because I picture this overwhelming wind, or maybe waves when you're in the ocean, just hammering you. But if you turn your back to it and try to walk away, it knocks you down, and it knocks you down face first into the sand. And then it's a harder fight, like Chris mentioned, to stand up. It'll make you tumble and roll, and you just get hammered more. And my first thought until Chris spoke was that it's often an unexpected circumstance or something that you don't have control over. And I think that's the circumstance for me, my definition, where it's truly leaning in. And I just picture just that forward lean into the storm that's battering you. And I've lately had a lot of experience with that. And we use the term embrace the suck, which I'm very fond of, where you just embrace it and you say, I'm going to go with it. And I'm going to be a part of this, and I'm going to feel it, like a lot of you said. My second definition personally is my daughter has a little tiny puppy. I mean, she's 3 years old, so she's full grown, but she's a tiny little dog, just the sweetest dog. And we call her the cat because she's scared to everything. She climbs up on the back of furniture, and she's tiny, but also because when cats loop around and make you pet them because your hand is dangling and they swoop under your hand, she does that. But she has this habit of, when I scratch her ears and pet her, just pushing into my leg, the front of my leg, and leaning against it. And no matter how bad my day is, she comforts me. It's very comforting to have that little dog. And everybody laughs when I walk her through the neighborhood, great big guy with a dog wearing a pig sweater. But for me, that second piece is how I present when I'm trying to lean in for somebody else. And I take her example, and I'm there. If it means that proverbial shoulder to cry on, I try to be that. And like you said, Paul, just listen. And it was tough in the beginning to sit there and listen because you have these thoughts flying through your head or things that you want to say. But after years of doing this, just allowing myself to immerse in their story and what they're doing, which is what we do here, is my second lean in. And Chris said something I think is important. I think that, and Jim mentioned this in a way too. Chris talked about preparing for that. And I feel we have the ability to sometimes induce intentional suffering on ourselves that builds long-term endurance. And there's any number of ways that we could do that. It may be simple, like watching a difficult documentary where we know it's going to be tough to get through, but we do that simply for the growth that we'll experience seeing that, or experiencing the pain from another person's perspective. On a harder level, we have things that we can do where we, through driving hard exercise, the stuff that pushes us, or like you mentioned, martial arts, Paul, or something, or fasting. Fasting is another way we can induce controlled suffering and realize what we're truly capable of, because we always stop sooner than we need to in those environments where we're pushing ourselves, running or going up a hill or whatever it is. And I feel in the long term, that gives us the resilience and personal strength to actually lean in when things get tough. Like you mentioned, a couple of you, illness or something. So that's my definition. So after this piece, does anybody have anything they'd like to add or comment on from this part of the discussion? Chris.
I just wanted to add one more time for those that are going to be watching later that you can start preparing for these things now, right? Don't wait until you're in the emotional, physical, or mental fight of your life to start trying to lean in, because it's hard. You don't just immediately start running a marathon. You can work on these things incrementally right now through your day, whether it's getting up for work, whether it's a tough project at work or whatever. The other thing too that I think is absolutely key is when you're leaning in, however you're picturing that, that also leads to some vulnerability. And with that vulnerability garners growth. Doesn't mean you have to put your chin all the way out there. But when you stand at attention, your chest is high and your head's up, doesn't mean you have to let your chin be out there so somebody can knock you out. But you can definitely barrel chest your way forward and keep solid on solid ground. And that's vulnerability with yourself. That's allowing yourself to kind of be put out there a little bit. And the physical analogy that Pat gave was, leaning in at like this 45, 50 degree angle. Maybe to start off with, you're only at 5 or 8 or 10 degrees. Just lean just a little bit, because you're going to have to learn how to get your balance. It's not going to be easy. This is something that you're going to have to practice every single day, multiple times a day if you're an idiot like me. But there will become a point, I can promise you, that it is almost muscle memory. Almost. Doesn't mean that you're not going to get knocked on your ass occasionally and have to figure out how to stand back up. But can you imagine what that blow would have been if you never started preparing for that, as Pat was saying?
Like I said, you often should be the wrap up, but I know Jim is in queue. So Jim, what do you have?
Well, I was just, you talked about the exercise and, marathons, I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned when you challenge yourself to a physical thing, right? You learn about yourself, what you can overcome, what challenges you can physically overcome. There's a mental aspect to that, you know, which you can then take. Okay, well, if I was able to overcome this physical feat, right, and talk myself through it and not give up and all those types of things, that prepares you, you know, for that next challenge that comes along, because you've learned a lot about yourself and how you can persevere, or how you can benefit from expeditionary behavior with others that are with you on that journey, you know, that type of thing. So I think there's a lot to be learned from challenging yourself and you know, persevering through that challenge, and the story you tell yourself in your mind about the value and importance of overcoming that and that type of thing.
I agree. I was thinking as you said that, you know, I'm talking to a guy who, as a lifetime firefighter, runs into buildings on fire, and there are police officers here who run into dark alleys to confront people, and nurses who go into emergency rooms, dispatchers, all of these people who have a living of leaning in. And it's funny how sometimes small tasks, like Janet was mentioning, that we have to get done, just defeat us because we don't think about where we've been. We look only ahead at the difficulty in front of us. So thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. Kelly.
Kelly, you're muted. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, is that better?
Much
Yes.
better.
I'm so sorry. So I think for me, one of the lessons, or the hard lessons that I had to learn about leaning in, is erasing expectations. And I think that it applied in my situation, not only expectations of myself and allowing the situation to be what it needed to be, but also erasing those expectations of others. You know, like I mentioned earlier with my husband, not expecting a particular response from those around us, and or allowing those responses to affect how we can lean in or whether we're willing to. It took me a very long time to stop expecting certain responses from people simply because I felt that's what I needed, and allowing them to respond to me in a way that's also healthy for them. And so for me, part of leaning in is also allowing others that lean in with me to do so in a way that is healthy for them.
Beautifully said. I couldn't, that's why we need this group, because I can't possibly imagine saying things as well as you guys do. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments on that piece? Okay, well, if you are watching this after the fact, hang on just a minute here, I want to double check. If you're watching this after the fact, this is the power of our story. And these exceptional people are people who get it. They've been down difficult roads and they've had to lean in their life. And now, as a testament to that, they're here. And it doesn't mean that they won't have circumstances that are difficult in the future. But we sometimes use the word tribe. This is a tribe of people that get together because of shared interest and circumstance. And so if you want to join us, you can. And you're almost missing the best part when we start talking before this and afterwards. So in just a moment here, we're going to stop this, and everybody stick around and we'll get to have a discussion that they don't get to see. So if you want to see it, come join us in the future.